how do you add animations and images to sprites in p5.play? In this video we'll cover how to load an image and associate it with a sprite in p5.play, how to load an animation from a series of images, how to load an animation from one file, like in a sprite sheet, and then how to, once you've loaded in multiple animations for a given sprite, how to change between multiple. So now we will be using some images for these animations that you can download either by going to the YouTube description or in Blackboard if you would like to follow along. So the first thing we need to get into our sketch here, I've loaded in my p5.play library, is to import some images. And to do that, you can click this little arrow up in the top left. And I'm going to create, before I upload some files, I'm going to create a folder where all of this will go. And I'll add that there. And then I'm going to put all my images in here. And so I've got these images prepared here. We've got a bunch of sprites. These are a bunch of kind of pre-made sprites. You can see that they're individual files here. And there are also some sprite sheets here. So we'll start, let's just import all of these things here. And then we'll talk about them as we add them and as we use them. So I'm going to click the little drop down next to my folder, hit upload file, and just drag in all of these files that we will use. Okay, so using images is in p5.play is the same as you'd use them in p5.js if you've done that prior. And so the way we do that is the process is essentially creating a variable to hold an image that we can then load into that variable and then use in our sketch. Now, one thing that is you should to note is that images are going to be loaded from a location on the web into your sketch, which if they're large files could take a little bit of time. And if you're trying to access the variable that you're loading in a file immediately after you've tried loading it and not waited until it's finished loading, it could cause problems. So to get around this fact, p5.js there's another function that you can use called preload. So you have to type this in yourself, function preload, open and close parentheses and curly brackets, and then within this function, if you load an image or load sounds or load any kind of media, it will wait to call the setup function until that loading has been done, so you can be assured that you won't run into any errors. All right, so in order to load an image, we are going to just create a variable, like I mentioned. I'll call this player image. And in preload, we can just say player image equals load image, and then in the parentheses, we're going to pass in the path to the image that we want to load. In this case, it's just assets is the folder. Make sure that if you have any folders that you've created, to include them. Then slash, which just means in that folder, and then I'm going to use person.png to load this. And if I play this, I shouldn't see anything because I've just loaded it into memory, into this variable. I'm not using it in any way. But I don't have any errors, so that probably means things have been loaded. This image has been loaded properly. Now, if I wanted to show that image to the screen, p5.js allows you to use this image function where you can pass in three things. The first is the variable for the image that we've loaded, so player img, and then the location on the screen where we want to see it. And so now we should see that, yep, indeed, it has been loaded properly, and we can see it now at 100. And you should just note that this is the p5.js way of doing things. So if we were to put this in setup, it's not going to show up because it's our background is going to kind of just be placed over it. Great. So now we know that we've got the image. We can show it to the screen. It's been loaded properly. Now, how do we associate this with the sprite? Let's do this the p5.play way. So first step is to create a sprite. So I'm going to create a player sprite here. And in setup, I'm going to say player sprite and set it equal to a new sprite. And we'll put it at a location on the screen. In this case, let's put it at in the middle of the screen, so 200 by 200. In the past, we might have put a diameter or a width and a height, but in this case, we can use the image size, like the pixel dimensions of the image that we are loading, to determine the sprite size, which it'll happen automatically once we load the sprite. So we load the sprite, or load the image into the sprite by using an add image function that's associated with this player sprite, that we just made, this variable, when we've created this new sprite here. So we can say player sprite dot add img is the function, and then we just need to pass in the variable that we've loaded that image into. And now if we run this, we should see now, instead of a circle or a square of a random color, we now have this image associated with that sprite that we've loaded in properly. Great. How do we now make this move? How can we use animations in different frames to make this little guy move? Well, similar process, very similar in fact, then using, for loading an image, instead of one image, we'll just use multiple. And you can use so again, we're going to create a variable to load in the imagery. So we'll say player anim, and I'll call this idle because that's the name of the animations that we're going to be loading in here. We're going to be using these first four, so 0, 1, 2, and 3, named idle. And you can see that it just kind of has the character bopping up and down. And you should just make sure that if you are using your own files, that they, in different frames of an animation, they all must have the exact same dimensions for it to kind of work properly. And these are all 64 by 64. So once we have that variable defined, we're going to again use our preload function and say load animation. And instead of just passing in one image here, we're going to be passing in a list, a number of different files. So if we look closely here, our files are called person-idle-00 is our first one. So person-idle-00. And then I'm just going to have a comma separated list for each file name. And if you return, it should kind of format things properly. And I'm just going to change those numbers and make sure I've got my commas in there. So a comma in between each. We've got 0, 1, 2, and 3. We've loaded the animation, and I'm going to take out this add image tag for a second and run this. And again, we see we're still using this sprite, but we took out the add image, so it's not showing that image anymore. We're not getting anything about this animation yet because we're just loading it to memory into this player anim idle variable. So now if we want to show that animation, we can do two things, the same as what we did with the p5.js sketch method, where we use image. There's something called animation function, and we can pass in player anim idle here and give it a location, say 100, 100, and then it should just play that animation on the screen. Now, this is just playing an animation on the screen. There's not a lot we can do with it at this point, which is in terms of like using it as a sprite within a game, where we can kind of leverage the power of p5.play. To do that, it's the same kind of process as what we did with the image. So instead of loading it using that image function or the animation function, remember with the image we just said player sprite add img. So we can do something similar with player sprite dot add ani. And instead of passing in the image name, we can just pass in our the image variable, pass in the animation variable. And if we press play, we'll now see our animation play. Now, it's kind of fast. You can see, and you can change the frame rate by putting in a delay. And to do that, you can just use that same, whatever animation that you loaded in, that variable name. You can use change this property called frame rate, lowercase f, capital R, E-T-E. And just give it, actually it's not frame rate, sorry, it's frame delay. And this is just a number of frames to delay before playing the next frame. And you can set, so we have something slower, it's a little bit easier to see. Great, so this is working. And notice that, it just plays the animation automatically. So you should just note that when you're using animation, in most game engines actually, you're always going to, once you add one animation to a sprite, it will always play that animation, unless you give it another one and change between that. But you will always be playing one animation or another. So if you want it to stop, often you'll have an animation state that just consists of one frame, since you're always playing one animation. So in this case, let's add another one. And let's do it a little bit differently this time. Let's add a run animation, but instead of using this method of adding each frame as a different file, let's use a sprite sheet. And included in the zip file is this sprite sheet for the person called running. And notice it's just a sprite sheet is just the same. It's just an image file, but instead of holding just one image of a frame of an animation, it's holding a number. So in this case, 4 different frames of this little guy jumping. And again, it has to be formatted properly so that each frame is the same width and height, so that the program can just go in and extract different frames by saying, okay, well, each one's 64 by 64. I've got 4 frames, because that's 4 times 64 is 256, so it will all load in properly. And the method for loading in a sprite sheet is, again, very similar to how we loaded it in just a number of files. So we'll do player anim, create a variable for this, call it run. And we're going to use the same load animation function, actually. And I'm going to put this here and call this player anim run, right? And we're going to load an animation. But we only have one file to load here, and it's going to be called person sprite sheet running. Remember, it's in our assets folder, person sprite sheet running.png. Now, it needs some additional information. It needs to know how big each frame is, and also how many frames there are. So to do that, we use this kind of somewhat weird syntax. So we do this comma, and then we have this curly brackets. And in these curly brackets, we're going to pass in the information about the dimensions and the number of frames. But before I forget, I'm going to put my end we need the end for this parentheses to make sure that we're closing that, and the semicolon at the end. And then the two things in the curly brackets, again, are our frame size and the number of frames. So we can do that by just saying frame size, colon, and then we're going to use brackets, kind of like an array, and say 64 by 64, the dimensions of our width and the height of our sprite. So you need to know that going in. And then how many frames, comma, and so it's comma and then frames, colon, and then the number. So I've got 4 frames here, 0, 1, 2, and 3. Now, if I run this, I can check to make sure I don't get any errors. I don't, which is good. But note, it still plays it's still playing the idle animation because we haven't loaded this run animation into our player sprite yet. But we can do that just as we did here. Instead of just saying add anim, or add this ani for the player anim idle, we can do the same for player anim run here. And if we do that, now we can see that it's showing the run animation. And essentially it's just going to show whatever animation you've added last is the state it will show, the animation that your sprite will show. And note that you can also change, just like we did up there with player anim idle, we can say player anim run dot frame delay and make it whatever we want here. So if we wanted to make it, a little bit different, a little bit faster than the idle, we can choose that there. Okay, this is good. We've got 2 different animations loaded, but how can we switch between them? And this is very simple. What we need to do is essentially we can name these different animations. And the way we do that is by, instead of just passing in the variable name, we can give it a name initially by saying, like just putting in a sprite. So, sorry, not a sprite, a string that's the name. So we can say, in this case, let's call this idle, and let's call this, you need your quotation marks, comma, and call this run. Now, what this allows us to do is use something called, change a property called ANI, which is essentially what animation is playing. So instead of playing the run animation, let's initially play the idle animation. So we can just say, let's have the active animation that is currently showing the idle instead of just the last one that we've loaded. Let's actually set it to be what we've named it here and play this player idle animation that we've loaded. And we have a problem because I'm using player and not player sprite, which is the variable name. And so see, we now have this animation show. The last step I'm going to do is kind of put this all together and see how you can use that player.ani property to change states while you're kind of doing interactive things. For example, having this character run around the screen. Now, to do that, in the previous video, we assigned up, down, left, right to set the velocity of the sprite. Now, I'll kind of keep it simple, but do something pretty similar. So I'll use that same kind of code in that we can say if the keyboard you're pressing the up, or let's just go left and right. So if we say left, then we can change our player velocity of x, and left is this way, which would be negative, so we can say -2. And we could say else if, kind of copy and paste this and change this to right, we can change this to +2. And I have an error here, and that is because I'm using this player sprite, the same thing I'm using the wrong variable name here. So let's just try to see if this works. If we press play, let's bring up the keyboard viewer here. And if we go left, right, we go right. So that's good, except I'm stopping press. I have stopped pressing, so I want to just, if I put kind of reset my velocity here to 0 each time, it should then, when I don't press it, reset it to 0 and won't get overwritten, and I will it should only move when I hold down the key. So I let go and it stops. Great, cool. So this is good, but now it would be cool if we could change that animation to run when we're moving, right? So what we can do is, as you might expect, let's just take this where we're changing this ani property, and we can just change this to run right here, right? And we have to do the same over here. Probably the easiest way to think about this. And if we were to try this, now click here, and it's running. Now, notice that it just continues running when I stop because I am no longer, it's just now in the run state. It never turns back to idle. So we only really want it to be idle in all cases when we're not pressing a key. So essentially, you could think, okay, well, maybe we'll just do this, change this to idle here, so that it always gets reset to idle, and only when you're moving, let go. Another way to do it, well, let's just keep it like this. This totally works. The last thing I'm going to show here is you can also, this works, right? But it would be cool if you turned the other direction when you press the left key. So there is another property that you can use to do this, and that's called mirror, and that's for sprites. So if you are, that's included in the p5.play library. So you can essentially say player sprite.mirror. And you can have an X mirror or a Y mirror to flip it vertically or horizontally. In this case, you want to flip it horizontally, and you can say either true or false if you want it to be mirrored. So, currently it's facing the right, so when it's moving left, we want to say true. Let's mirror that and show it facing the other direction. And then when it's facing right, let's change it back to false, so it's not being mirrored. It's the same as it, when you initially loaded it. If we save this and run it, now we click to give it focus, move left, it looks left and right. And there we have our animated character.